Hi, Richard. This is your clock after I've completed most of the assembly. You see some parts over here still, but most of the assembly has been completed. And this is a test stand that I have that I can test different kinds of movements on. And I just want to show you a couple things about the clock so you have some idea what your clock does. So I've probably already shown you pictures of all the pivots being polished and the disassembly and the bushings being put in the holes and so on. There were a lot of levers in here that were bent incorrectly. I've solved all that in the reassembly process. The escapement needed some adjustment, and now I'm just going to give you a little idea of what happens here. So the first thing that we talk about always, almost everybody thinks that the pendulum runs the clock, when it's just the opposite. The clock is running the pendulum. So you see the pendulum moving back and forth, and you see right up in here there's a gear that's turning, and that gear wants to turn because we've wound the spring up down here, which turns that gear, then that gear, then that gear. But if you stop the pendulum, you see that there's no motion on the pendulum, but the gear is not turning either. So when you look closely at this gear, you'll see that just below it is a little piece called a verge. And I've made some adjustments to this too. Somebody had bent the pieces here and geometry was wrong. But when the pendulum is not moving, nothing runs. And when you start the pendulum, the verge will start to go back and forth. And when it goes in one direction, a tooth escapes from one side and a tooth hits the other side. And that pushes the pendulum. And it also creates the tick. Then gravity pulls the pendulum back down, and a tooth escapes from the side that it just hit on and hits the other side, pushing the pendulum in the opposite direction. And that action just keeps going back and forth as long as it's ticking regularly, and I'll talk more about that when you get here to pick it up. But that's the ticking side, that's the driving side, the part that drives the pendulum, these gears. These gears over here are the striking side. And this clock, of course, has a strike. When I got this clock from you, it did not strike the half hour. At least I'm pretty sure it didn't. There was somebody had bent the half hour strike, and I've fixed that as well. So as the minute hand approaches, you'll see the hammer is being lifted up just below my finger. And as we cross over the half hour, the hammer drops. On the half hour, the hammer just drops. On the hour, it's actually going to turn these gears over here, and using this count wheel, it's going to count. So this count wheel has a lever going into it, and you'll see the lever right here, and you'll see it has a deep slot. And then there's a series of more narrow slots. I'm going to run some light over here. Or not as deep slots, to another deep slot, and then so on and so on. So the deep slots are where it stops counting, and there is always one more slot between the deep slots, starting with 1 o'clock and going on to 12 o'clock. That's a count wheel. There are levers up in here and cams on gears over here, and there's a pin on this gear here. So as a clock starts to, as the minute hand gets nearer the 12, the hour, levers start to lift up, and you saw it just release, and then it stopped. And that's called the warn. The clock has warned itself it's going to start to count. And by the way, earlier, again, before I got this apart, I noticed that the hammer was being lifted up on the warn. And that is not, we call that lifting on the warn, and the hammer should not do that. There should be no tension on this train of gears. They should run freely when they start to count. When we get over to the 12 here, they should start to count or spin, and then pick the hammer up after they've built up some momentum. So I have solved that problem as well. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to cross over, and it starts to count. And you can see the counting action taking place right down here. And the hammer is dropping, and it just keeps counting until it goes into a deep slot. and each segment between the deep slots is 1 hour further. And it just keeps going like that around and around. There's also a little pin sticking out down here, right above my finger, right behind the pendulum. This is a manual synchronization lever. You push it up. I'm going to stop the pendulum. You push it up and it releases the gears and it will start to count again. So if the hands ever aren't synchronized with the count, you would push that lever up and release it, and it advances the count wheel 1 hour for each time you do that. So that's a little synopsis of how this all works. And again, when you get here, we'll talk about more. There you go.